We are hugely excited about this next part of the conference when we talk in detail about the support we can provide neurodiverse members of our community. So let me introduce you to Elise Wulff. Elise has been working with the neurodiverse population in both the public and private sectors for over 15 years. At Massachusetts General Hospital, Boston, Elise works in the Aspire program, overseeing child programming, parent programming, and related services where participants engage in multidisciplinary, strengths-based learning. She has expertise in inclusive practices, program design, social emotional learning, tools to build independence, and strategies for executive functioning. Elise, we're excited for you to talk today. So let's get into it.
Excellent. Thank you for that introduction. If we take away the layers of vocabulary, my life and professional work has really been about creating neurodiversity forward practices where we value the strengths that an individual contributes because they experience the world differently. So really making sure that that is the forward of the script. So today I'm really excited to be here talking about where social competency, which I'll talk about what that means, and executive functioning, which I'll talk about what that means, come together. I want to thank you for joining me, and I look forward to also having what I hope to be a lively Q&A at the end. I like to practice what I preach in my own executive functioning coaching work. So we will work through these 4 discussion topics. First, what do I mean by social competency? Then, what role does executive functioning play in our ability to successfully navigate the social world? I'm going to talk explicitly about 2 specific areas for skill development that I often see overlooked when it comes to promoting independence for neurodivergent individuals. And then lastly, I will speak directly to caregivers, providers, and support people on the call. When we're working with someone who might benefit from our feedback in the moment, how we can do that in a respectful, collaborative way to help steer them towards perhaps a more socially successful outcome. These are the more explicit learning objectives that I hope to accomplish by the end of our time today. I am going to give a brief overview of where I come from within the larger Mass General Hospital, the beast that is the largest Mass General Hospital, which I know I have in common with some individuals on this call today. So I come out of the Aspire program. Now, our direct services serve individuals that identify as autistic, Asperger's syndrome, or otherwise neurodivergent. You do not have to have a specific diagnostic profile to engage with us. And we serve individuals ages 5 all the way through adulthood in a variety of models, individual coaching, group situations, parent caregiver support networks, as well as consultation. So I'm really here to talk about the work that I'm doing and exploring with my colleagues in consulting to neurotypical individuals and neurotypical settings to help them be aware of some of their blind spots when it comes to being inclusive of neurodiverse individuals, as well as how do we build educational and therapy-based structures that are truly neurodiverse centered. Our core curriculum, and I should back up and say that in our consultation work, we expand on our expertise related to autism, Asperger's, and similar profiles to think more globally about what we've learned about executive functioning, social competency, and the neurodiversity movement in general. Our core curriculum focuses on the 3 buckets you see listed here: social competency, stress management, and self-awareness. Now, while we call them 3 buckets, they're certainly not distinct, because any of us, neurotypical or neurodiverse, would, I believe, this may be an assumption, acknowledge that socializing and putting forth our best social selves is dependent on us not being in fight or flight. And so while I'm not specifically going to talk about stress and anxiety management today, I would be remiss if I didn't acknowledge that we need to prioritize stress and anxiety management in order to then be thinking about meeting and fulfilling our desires and our goals when it comes to social communication, social connection, and social competency. So what do I mean when I say social competency? Well, what you see listed here are a couple of bullet points. First, recognize that social competency is needed in life. This is not the same thing as being taught or told or believing that you need to mask or camouflage your true self because you are around people that expect something differently of you. That knowledge should enter into our decision-making when it comes to what social decisions we make. And I really want to be pushing us forward away from the idea that social competency is about blending and fading into neurotypical norms, and instead empowering us that we can be our natural social selves while we also understand the way that the social game tends to work in a world designed by and still primarily driven by neurotypical individuals. Some other things here. We need to understand our own unique social strengths and challenges. We need to develop social communication skills. We need to be able to take what we've learned and apply it in different settings where things might be slightly or largely different. We need to be able to show empathy for others, and we need to be able to form positive relationships, work in teams effectively, and deal effectively with conflict. In addition, I've also included the bullet points to break down what I mean when I say stress management, as well as I've included the bullet points for what I mean when I say self-awareness. I apologize right now that I have flown through some of those. These PowerPoints are available to you in recording form as well as this PDF. So please feel free to go back and revisit that as your processing style would benefit. So the 4 core concepts that come together in any given moment in time to help someone be social are emotional regulation, sensory processing, our social communication, and our executive functioning. So while when we have social groups, we tend to think of that as a very, quote, simplistic concept, right? Well, I have to help you understand this skill so that you can go out and use it. Social competency is about being able to take what you have learned about how the world might work, layer that with your own goals and objectives and your social drives, but then also at the same time, be able to manage your sensory needs, your emotional regulation, and the needs of the other person to work towards a shared goal. So it's certainly just a very complex system that I don't think we give as much credit to how complex it is to become socially competent. So what am I going to focus on today? I'm going to focus on 2 areas of social competency that are 2 separate goal areas. I often see these mixed up as one, but I'll try to stay off of that soapbox for now. So when it comes to social competency, I want people to be thinking about 2 different areas for development. One area for development is communication skills. What I mean by communication skills are just the explicit techniques you use to be able to engage with and around other people. For example, do I know how to add a thought to a conversation? Do I know how to structure a follow-up question? Do I know how to talk about something that I just don't care about? Do I know how to stop talking once I start talking about something I really care about? These are the mechanics of social communication. This is a great match for one-on-one coaching, therapy, social groups. The limitations of those therapeutic settings are when it comes to social fulfillment. So on one side, we have the communication skills that often benefit from explicit instruction, really breaking down. I had a conversation the other day, why are knock-knock jokes funny? It's like, well, all right, let me think about this. So those are explicit conversations about why people do what they do socially. The other bucket is social fulfillment, which means you as an individual have a subjective experience. You say, this person makes me feel good. I want to be around them more. And that exists at the same time as you needing to use social mechanics skills. So I'm based in the United States, and I often support teams to write IEPs. An IEP is an educational plan for an individual student. And IEPs can often include social goals we want to help this person work towards. And sometimes I see an IEP that will say something like, this individual will identify 7 positive relationships. That is mixing up communication skills that can and should be taught and measured with autonomy and social fulfillment. So you see 2 images listed here. You see pictured here. There's an image of classical musicians playing in a symphony, and there's a more artistic rendering of jazz musicians. I'm going to use these 2 images to present an analogy about what a neurodiversity forward, an independence building social fulfillment approach would look like and wouldn't look like. So jazz musicians, jazz music, if we were here in person, I could see all of your wonderful faces. I might ask you to raise your hand if you prefer jazz music over classical. I'd say, okay, put your hands down. Now raise your hand if you prefer classical over jazz. Okay, put your hands down. Somehow these 2 preferences can coexist, right? We're not trying to battle out one or the other. Jazz musicians have a certain way of performing music, practicing music, jazz culture. It's very improvisational. In fact, it rewards improvisation. When they get together and rehearse, it will sound different than in the concert. What we wear is very fluid and not prescribed at all. Classical musicians have a very prescribed wardrobe. What we play in rehearsal should sound the same, if not similar, if not exactly the same when we get to performance. The tempo and volume have been written on the page for 300 years. How we enter the space, where we sit, and what we wear is extremely consistent, even internationally. That's a highly structured type of music. If we take this analogy and compare it to social fulfillment, some people are socially fulfilled as jazz musicians, as jazz socializers. That sounds like, you want to meet for coffee next Tuesday? Sure. Oh, I'll call you Monday night and we'll figure out where. That sounds like calling someone up on your ride home and having a 40-minute conversation to catch up. Improvisational, unpredictable. That is very fulfilling to some socializers. Other socializers will meet every Saturday at 10 a.m. We will play 35 minutes of Dungeons and Dragons. Then we'll go have brunch at the same place. Maybe we even order in. We split the tab, and maybe we don't talk again until next week. That is highly structured socializing that we cannot and should not say is less than or less fulfilling than the jazz musician way of socializing. So my final point with this analogy is that you, as a caregiver, provider, or individual on this call, you might be a jazz socializer. Other people on this call might be classical socializers. When you find yourself in the role to be coaching or supporting someone to find their social fulfillment, let them determine the type of relationships that will bring them fulfillment, and it may be different than your own. So finding meaningful relationships is a different skill building process than building the skills to have structured conversations or negotiate conflict. What else do we need to be on the same page about when it comes to social competency? It's a holistic concept, especially in these digital days, where in order to truly be removing barriers, we have to have access to technology. We have to have digital literacy, know how to use that technology, know how to be safe building social connections online. We have to have a strong self-esteem that says we can put ourselves out there. So even things like visual spatial skills, personal space is just as much about understanding what personal space is as it is having a visual spatial skill set that allows you to see that in real time. So social competency requires a holistic approach, and I want people to be looking at it from all angles. So what is executive functioning? Executive functioning is the vehicle for socialization. It's how we go from talking the talk, recognizing and knowing certain social communication skills and desires, and implementing it in real time. What you see here are what are commonly recognized as the 6 domains of executive function. running through them very quickly, we have activation, not entirely, but somewhat synonymous with initiation, focus, effort, emotions, memory, and action. Action, we might consider the ability to follow through on tasks despite or in the presence of maybe flexible thinking or other obstacles. So if you look at these 6 domains and think about your socializing on a daily basis, you're probably using all 6 in any given interaction, which is why I think is one of the most undervalued components of social communication. For example, to have a back and forth conversation with someone else, it's not just about knowing how to ask follow-up questions. It's about, I need to maintain my engagement in this conversation, even if my interest in what you're saying ebbs and flows. Memory. I need to be able to take in, store, and recall information about people in relevant situations. So moving forward with today, I'm going to use this frame of how can we help individuals become more independent in their social competency through the lens of executive functioning. I'm going to take 1 second to just check the chat to make sure I'm not missing anything. Great, thank you. So social competency. There is a comic strip on the screen and I will read it out loud. There is a young boy marching confidently towards his mother. He stops in front of his mother and he says, "Ahem." She says, "Hi." The next frame, the mother has moved on and the boy is looking confused. And the final frame, the boy says, "What's the point of wearing your favorite rocket ship underpants if nobody ever asks to see them?" This is an introduction to the first of the 2 skills I want to highlight today, which is perspective. This comic highlights that in this moment in time, this boy, in his mind, has a feature that he wants to connect with his mother about. His mother does not have that same perspective. She has no idea that he is even wearing rocket ship underpants. So then it really leads to an invisible miscommunication where the boy now feels slighted and undervalued that she didn't ask him about his rocket ship underwear. This is a disconnect in perspective taking that I see play out all the time. A clinical version of this, for those of you that might be familiar with this term, is theory of mind. The idea that you can acknowledge other people may or may not have the same perspective on a situation in any given moment. So on the next slide, we have to talk about this idea of perspective and how do we help people grow it, enhance it, and apply it. There's an optical illusion. When you first look at this optical illusion, some of you might see a young woman looking back over her shoulder. Others of you look at this and right away see an older woman with her head, kind of her chin nestled down in the collar of her shirt. Both of those are right. And your brain told you, for whatever reason, to pay attention to one over the other. This is how we need to start to think about approaching social interactions and coaching individuals in our care, or even ourselves reflecting on the fact that any situation has multiple things happening at the same time. So when you approach a situation, here are the steps to perspective taking. My first take home for today is just to acknowledge these are steps. Make sure that we're all clear about these are the steps to perspective taking. These are all of the automatic things that have to happen before we even start talking to one another. I notice the situation and the people. I notice I'm sharing space. I notice we're sharing an activity. I am thinking about you and recognize you are also having thoughts about me, but we're not having the same thought. Very rarely are people ever having the exact same thought at the exact same time. That's an important acknowledgement. I observe you to actively think about your motive, your intention, or your plan. I recognize that you have thoughts, feelings, and behaviors that are independent and different from mine, and that I make adjustments on my behavior based on feedback from you. This is what we call the hidden curriculum. And it's often something that we don't think about teaching in social communication because we're so focused on behavior. We're so focused on what it looks like to be social that we don't do this deeper, oh, that's right, all this stuff happens before I even open my mouth. So how can we break this down and be more concrete to facilitate independence? One way is to think about building social fulfillment in a very concrete, executive functioning centered way. This is called the social pyramid. As you move up the social pyramid, it indicates that your relationship with someone else is getting more and more intimate or closer and closer. So the bottom layer of the pyramid might be strangers. The next layer up might be acquaintances. The next layer up might be colleagues or friends, best friends, and we can go up from there with certain vocabulary. Many cultures and different languages have vocabulary we can add here in French, le petit ami, etc. When we're helping someone or even ourselves thinking about how to navigate the complexities of relationships, we want to ask very concrete questions. For example, how often do you see this person? Under what circumstances do you see them? And what modes of communication do you use? The answers to those questions give you data that from a very concrete executive functioning friendly approach tells you if that relationship is moving up the pyramid or in the just right place. This brings together the two goal areas I talked about earlier, but it's the individual being supported to understand the data about how this relationship is trending. So you'll see a couple of other concrete questions on the screen. This brings us into collaboration, as opposed to, I often see providers and caregivers with absolute best intentions, seeing people form questionably appropriate relationships, or especially in the days of social media, saying, oh, this is my best friend. And we might have questions about that, wanting to steer people towards safe and healthy relationships. Joining with your loved ones to have concrete conversations is a way to help you navigate that terrain. The next skill I want to talk about is how do we help people build those relationships, enhance them, to go back to that memory component of executive functioning. So what you see on the screen here is a grid. This grid lists the list of individuals on the left, and then along the top of it are categories of interest. The first step in building relationships from an executive functioning realm is to take what you learn in conversations, give it value so that you can store it, and then recall it later to act on to enhance relationships. So the first stage of this approach is called recall and organize, which is you literally making a grid. I often, people hear me give this recommendation and they're like, oh, I have that. I do mind files. No. A neurodiversity forward mentality says, I value your executive functioning profile. We are literally going to make this grid. We're going to write out the people that you're curious about. We're going to write out topics you may or may not know about them. And we're going to pull that out of your brain to tell your brain this has value. That's step one. Step two is plan to expand. You look at the places that you're missing social information and you make a plan for how you're going to fill it in. Okay, so again, these communication skills and social fulfillment are coming back together through a very executive functioning friendly lens. These are the 4 boxes highlighted in blue that I don't know about these people. I now plan for how I'm going to expand my knowledge about this person. I'm going to ask them their favorite show when I see them on the train on Monday, or when I see them in class on Tuesday. I'm going to see if they have a favorite color. This now drives small talk, and it gives it some intention. The last phase of this is called analyze to act, which is where you look at what data you have in your grid. You find shared interests, and then you build activities and play dates or social gatherings or romantic dates off of concretely aligned special interests. For example, Vishnu and I both like Survivor. I use that to act on next steps. I emphasize this stage in working with adults and their caregivers because it's often really difficult to figure out how to initiate the next phase of social interaction. How can I help my adults take ownership of structuring social engagement? And this is one way to support that. So I'm going to transition now into my last recommendation, which is how do we give in the moment feedback when socially we want to steer towards success? I'm going to sidestep for a second and talk about a piece of interesting research that's neurodiversity forward. And it's actually been around for quite a long time. So as we said earlier, the foundation of social competency is acknowledge we're sharing space with others, watch for clues from them, interpret them. This is why practicing what facial expressions mean is really, really worth the time. And then we go through this phase of this dance, sometimes quite literally, of how do I keep steering towards a positive outcome and avoid negative outcomes by responding to the clues I get from you about whether or not this is working. One way to address this is to think about eye gaze and attention, but not in the traditional look at me behavioral sense. What you see on this slide is a snapshot from a study done by Ami Klin out of Yale. This one specific study I want to share with you and share with you why it matters for my next recommendation. This is a gross oversimplification, but in the interest of time, he gave 2 individuals highly sensitive eye tracking gear to wear while they watched the movie Who's Afraid of Virginia Woolf. Now, this movie is just robustly filled with social communication. There's tons of nonverbal and a lot of subtlety. It's a very rich social movie. So he brought 2 individuals in and he had them both watch this movie. Now, the individuals that watched this movie were matched on a variety of other features from a research angle in terms of IQ, among other features. There are 2 kind of funky looking lines on this picture. There's a white line and a black line. The 2 individuals, the difference between them was that one individual was diagnosed with Asperger's, autism, and the other individual did not have a formal diagnosis. The white line that you see here follows a pattern of hovering over this individual's face, tracing over to this gentleman, then up on the wall at an image, then back to this gentleman. That is the sequence of this scene. There's a conversation happening between this gentleman over to this gentleman and about something on the wall. That white line traces the eye pattern of the neurotypical individual while watching this scene. This black line right here traces the eye pattern of the autistic individual while watching this scene, where we hover over here, then we kind of look at the papers on the desk, we float up here. If you look at both of those lines, the white line and the black line, one of them follows an organized pattern to gather social data from this scene. The black line does not map onto where there is the most relevant social data in this scene. Now, we shouldn't jump to the assumption that one person was better able to understand this scene than the other. However, there is a very, very big difference in the information they took in. So it does lead us to have the hypothesis of, if we are looking at different things, can we have the same social comprehension? And this was replicated throughout the movie on a variety of measures. Time spent up here looking at facial expressions, time spent looking at eyes versus jaws, how long in a volley of a conversation we follow back and forth. So it's a fascinating, very, very small sample, but it's a fascinating neurodiversity forward approach to thinking about eye gaze and socializing. This became known as the social attention theory, that says we get information about a social situation from what we are attending to. Being neurodiversity forward, let's stick specifically with autistic individuals. Autistic individuals may be drawn to automatically look at different things that have different meaning to them in a given situation than neurotypical people might look at to gather social information. This could put neurodiverse people at a disadvantage for gathering social information. So this is the work that guides my final recommendation heading into today, which is a strategy called declarative language. This is how we would offer in-the-moment support to someone in a social interaction wanting them to steer towards productive outcomes. So historically, when we do social coaching, we give the behavioral outcome. right? We say hi to him, extend your hand, move closer, back away, you're too close. We do all of the executive functioning observation work, and we give the directive at the end. That's a behavioral lens to socializing. What I am proposing, and which is a widely recognized technique, there's a fantastic book on Amazon called The Declarative Language Handbook by Linda Murphy, who was highly influential in the RDI movement. So I highly suggest checking that out. What we are suggesting is declarative language, which is to bring your partner in when you start to make those observations, so that they join you for what observations you even take in, that even then lead you to believe that there's something you should do with your behavior. This sounds different. This sounds like, I noticed she just walked into the room. And then there's wait time. This is neurodiversity 4. We're giving processing time. Here are a couple of other examples of what this sounds like. Behavioral would be, it's my turn to talk. Social cognitive declarative language would sound like, I'm wondering if I'll get to share my perspective. So here are some examples on the screen about shifting away from that behavioral imperative lens into a collaborative social cognitive lens. This is not a sarcastic intervention. Please be careful of that. But it invites your partner to join into your social observations, to then think about what behavioral outcome would they suggest happen next, to steer towards greater independence in social communication conversations. So with that, I'm really, really pleased to be able to open it up for some question and answer. This was very dense. My hope was to provide a handful of toolbox options, 1 or 2 or 1 that might meet a need that you have right now in terms of furthering your own independence socially or as a caregiver. I'm happy to take a look at the chat and see if there are any questions there.
Oh, I have a couple of questions for you, Elise. In the chat, I have Katie here next to me. Katie's 25, and she gave me so much feedback on your talk. In the last couple of slides, she said, Mom, you do that.
Like, you do a lot of...
Yep. Say hi.
Hi. You do a lot of...
Yeah, direct. Imperative language.
Like, say hi, Katie. Or, why don't you go say hi to that person?
Yep. Yeah. So we have some questions, if that's okay.
Absolutely.
That's okay with you. There are a lot of apprehension from parents on letting their children go. Can you offer some insights or experiences on the benefits of creating this independence for people with neurodiversity? Because it can be hard not to step in and want to protect them all the time.
Absolutely. So first, I want to commend the parents that are acknowledging that, because in my experience, parents that any caregiver, whether it's a sibling or any caregiver that can step back and say, I love you so much that I'm really probably overstepping. Right? Those are the people that we're gonna use that self-awareness to find the right place. So great question. I think it's important to have clear, agreed upon goals, because when it comes to socializing, you could talk about anything, right? There are an infinite number of things that someone could be coached on socially. I do social coaching and I need social coaching. So I think coming together with your loved one around, can we pick 2 things that we can agree are really pressing, important topics to talk about with socializing? And the goal of that conversation is then, if it's not one of our agreed upon 2 or 3 goals, we don't give coaching on it. We might save it in the back of our mind and say, when we revisit this conversation in 3 months, I'm really going to advocate that we talk about interrupting. So you can, but I think neurodiverse individuals, and I myself am neurodivergent, we get a lot of feedback. Get a lot of feedback. So come together, you loved one, whether your child is 5, 25, 35, come together and say, let's talk about what we really want to target, where I can, it's okay to give you feedback, and how would you like me to give you that feedback in the moment or after the fact? And that tells us what we're going to let go for a little while. And that's a collaboration, right? So you as a parent or caregiver get to say, I really think we need to prioritize polite interruptions. And you as the adult or individual might say, but I really want to know how to get a date. That in itself is even a really productive conversation. So I think adding structure to it is a recommendation I have.
I like that. I like that a lot. Thank you. Thank you very much. One of the other questions that we had was, how do we get our children and young adults into community programs, or at least to interact with the community? The available support from a community can be very varied.
Yeah.
So what do you think about that?
Yeah. This is tough to answer globally because of what this person said, right? They've already gotten ahead of my initial reaction, which is, oh, you have to be really careful putting yourself out there. So I think my first reaction is start with structured, preferred, shared interest activities, things where your loved one brings currency to the table, their knowledge of geography, their passion for anime. Start with structure and targeted content as opposed to a fluid kind of social group or after school club. Really go for the structure and the shared interest. I think my second piece of feedback is have conversations up front about the inclusion philosophy of this clinic, the resource or the clinic after school, whatever it is. What's your inclusion philosophy? What resources are available? If my child ran into an issue, how would you help them navigate it? What role do you expect parents and caregivers to play? Ask those generic questions up front. And that will tell your gut if this is a place that we should be spending time or not. And then my third recommendation is think about either you as an individual or you with your caregiver, making a one-pager. Hey, this is who I am. These are my real strengths, what I bring to a group of people. Here are some things that I know are going to bother me. Here are some things that if you see them happen, can you do X, Y, and Z? Now, I want to go back and emphasize one-pager. And this, you cannot make it 10-point font with 0.5 margins, one-pager.
She's reading my mind is what happened.
What?
She's reading my mind. You are too good at this. You're way too good at this. One of the question was, how does hearing loss figure into this?
Yeah, that's a great question.
Patty.
Well, we have kids and adults who have hearing loss. So
absolutely. Thank you for bringing this up, because we want to be inclusive of and recognizing that social communication is hello. Thank you for asking. Social communication, going back to that holistic slide earlier, is so much about different sensory domains that are often overlooked. And so I think when it comes to hearing loss, I think it's, and kind of the deafness spectrum, I think it's about empowering individuals to recognize where they can gather social information and developing self-advocacy scripts that might help the conversational partner recognize which pieces of social competency are a more effective way to get information across. So for example, I actually just ran a workshop earlier today about the limitations of auditory communication. And so really developing self-advocacy scripts to say, I rely heavily on facial expressions to understand my conversational partner's intentions. I'm not getting a lot from your affect. So developing, and whether or not that's because you want to disclose hearing loss or not, or you just want to say, this is what I need to be my best socializer. So I think it's about making sure other people double empathy, right? It's about the double empathy theory, making sure other people understand how many sensory domains there are to effective social communication, and then making sure we're empowered to have self-advocacy scripts so that we can ask our partners or group members to give us what we need to gather that data without being overly reliant on auditory processing.
Thank you. Our next question is, how, as caregivers or people with Myhre, do we explain how they or we view the world so that people can understand?
I love this question, and I want my first reaction to be, I'm not the best person to answer it because I do not identify with Myhre. If you want to talk to me about OCD, bipolar, I want to empower first person lived experience individuals to answer that question. So I can't, and I don't think I want to.
Okay, it's all right. As soon as I said it and you,
Mom, you're muted.
oh, shoot, oop.
No, I can hear you.
No,
You're good.
no.
I think what I will say is
No.
having those resources available, having the first person narratives and pumping them out there so that people can learn about Myhre from the lived experience is my answer.
If you wanted parents to, actually, before I ask that question, what needs to happen to be a neurodiverse forward world? And are we doing enough?
No. Oh, no. No, we're not. What we need to do is recognize our blind spots, and we need to include conversations about neurodiversity in the larger category of diversity, equity, and inclusion. So I work a lot with corporations, and if you read corporations' DE&I statements, they don't mention neurodiversity. We need to make sure that people understand neurodiversity is a component of diversity, equity, and inclusion, and that disability can exist at the same time as a strengths-based lens. So I think it's about applying the same kind of social reckoning phases that we have applied, and we're continuing to educate ourselves in other categories such as race, religion, gender. But first, I think we need to get this vocabulary out there, correct the fact versus fiction that neurodiversity does not mean we do not run into challenges. No. Neurodiversity means that our challenges have existed because of societal functions, and our different ways of experiencing the world do give us strengths and advantages. There's a lot to unpack there, but I think we really need to be vocal about attaching neurodiversity and disability rights to DE&I.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate your time. Our last question was, what one thing from your presentation would you want us to take? But I think your last slide went through some of the things that you highlighted during your presentation. So thank you so much. And it is absolutely fantastic because your presentation and the one that's coming following you, I think, complement each other so well. So Elise, thank you so much for being with us this afternoon.